They told us Peleliu would fall in 3 days. 3 days. I heard that before I stepped into the landing craft, before I smelled gasoline mixed with vomit, before I saw the first man drop face first into the white sand. Back then, I still believed a battle had a beginning, a middle, and an end. But Peleliu was not a battle. Peleliu was a small island that learned how to kill men slowly. I am an old man now. My hands shake when I pour coffee. My knees ache when it rains. But there is one thing in me that has never aged, never softened, never gone quiet. And that is the memory of that island. For decades, I told people I didn't remember much. That was a lie. I remembered everything. I just didn't have the words for it, or maybe I didn't have the courage. Now I am running out of time, and I think it is time to tell the truth, even the parts that don't make me look brave, especially those parts. Before Peleliu, I was just a kid from a small town who thought he understood what courage was. I had grown up on stories, my uncle's stories from the First War, movies at the picture house, recruiting posters with square-jawed men staring at some glorious horizon. I joined the Marines because I wanted to be one of those men. I wanted my father to look at me differently. I wanted, I suppose, to prove something to myself that I didn't even know needed proving. They trained me to march, to shoot, to take orders without asking why, to move forward when every nerve in my body screamed to do the opposite. They trained my legs and my hands and my reflexes. What they could not train was the part of me that would have to live with what I saw. Nobody trains you for that. You find out on your own, on your knees, in the sand, with someone's blood on your hands, and no manual telling you what to do with the feeling that comes after. I remember the ship in the days before the landing. The heat below decks was suffocating, thick with the smell of diesel sweat, and the cigarettes men smoked one after another, because there was nothing else to do with shaking hands. Some of us cleaned our rifles for the 10th time, not because they needed it, but because cleaning a rifle is something to do with your hands when your mind keeps wandering somewhere you don't want it to go. Some men wrote letters. I wrote one to my mother. I told her not to worry, that the officers said this operation would be short, a few days at most, and that I would probably be home before her garden finished blooming. I believed it when I wrote it. That is the strange thing about belief. It does not require truth, only repetition. The veterans among us, the ones who had already seen places like Guadalcanal or Cape Gloucester, did not write letters with confident promises. They were quiet in a different way. They checked their gear without talking. They slept or pretended to. I noticed McCleary, a wiry man with a permanent half-smile that never quite reached his eyes, sharpening his knife slowly, over and over, long after it was already sharp enough to shave with. I asked him once if he was nervous. He looked at me like I had asked something foolish and said, "Nervous is for men who don't know what's coming. I know what's coming. That's worse." I didn't understand what he meant. Not yet. There was a kid named Eddie Walsh, barely 18, from somewhere in Ohio, who carried a photograph of his sister tucked under the webbing of his helmet. He showed it to anyone who would look, not out of vanity, but because talking about her seemed to calm him. She had dark curly hair and a gap-toothed smile, and Eddie said she wrote him a letter every single week without fail. He talked about going home and teaching her to drive a car. He talked about it so often that some of the men teased him gently, but nobody ever told him to stop. I think we all needed someone to believe in home as hard as Eddie did. There was Ramirez, who barely spoke at all. He prayed under his breath, a rosary wound so many times around his fingers that the beads had worn smooth and shiny. Nobody bothered him about it. In a place like that, you let a man have whatever kept him standing. And there was Sergeant Collins, who had a face like cracked leather, even though he could not have been older than 30. He did not waste words. He checked on us constantly. Boots, water, ammunition, the look in our eyes, like a man counting something precious that kept slipping through his fingers. Later, I understood that he already knew, better than any of us, how many of his counts would come up short before this was over. On the morning of the landing, the ship's engines went quiet differently than usual, and that silence told us more than any announcement could. We climbed down the cargo nets into the landing craft, and the boats rose and fell on a sea that seemed indifferent to what was about to happen. The air smelled of salt and exhaust and something else. Fear, maybe, though fear doesn't have a smell, except that it does, sour and metallic, coming off your own skin. Peleliu sat on the horizon, a low green smudge wrapped in smoke. The naval bombardment had been going on for days. Shells screamed overhead and burst on the island in long flashes that lit the morning like sick lightning. Trees splintered. The air shook even from miles out. I remember thinking, with the simple confidence of a man who has never seen real war, that nothing could survive that. No human being could live through that kind of fire. The officers told us the same thing. Softened up, they said, like the island was a piece of meat being tenderized before the meal. We believed them. We were wrong, dead wrong, in a way that would cost us everything we had. The Japanese soldiers were not standing on the beach waiting to be blown apart. They were inside the island itself, in caves carved into coral ridges, in bunkers reinforced with steel and concrete, in tunnels that connected one position to another so that a gun could fire from one spot and vanish before our return fire ever landed. The bombardment had cratered the surface and burned the trees, but the island's true defenses were buried, patient and very much alive. The landing craft surged forward in long lines, engines roaring, spray slapping our faces. Somewhere, a coxswain was shouting something I couldn't hear over the noise. My stomach was a fist. My mouth was dry. Already, before we'd even hit the beach, my mouth was dry, and I did not yet understand that this dryness would become the defining sensation of my entire war. Then the world tore open. Geysers of water erupted around the boats as enemy shells found their range. I heard rounds punching through metal hulls somewhere down the line. Heard screaming that didn't sound human, not at first. The ramp dropped, and the order came to move, and my legs moved before my brain agreed to it. Training taking over where thought failed. I ran into knee-deep water that turned pink in patches. The beach was white coral sand, blinding under the sun, and it was already littered with things I tried not to look at directly. Equipment, men, pieces of men. Machine gun fire raked the open beach from positions we could not see. Fire that seemed to come from the ridges themselves, from the island, as if the land had teeth. I threw myself down behind a shattered log, coral biting into my palms and knees, and that was the first time I really understood what Peleliu was. It wasn't a place we were going to capture. It was something we were going to have to survive, inch by inch, and the island did not care how many of us it took to make us understand that. I want to tell you something I have never told anyone, Not even my wife in 50 years of marriage. In those first minutes on the beach, I was not thinking about my country, or freedom, or the men beside me. I was thinking only one thought, over and over, in a loop that wouldn't stop. I don't want to die on this sand. I don't want to die on this sand. That is what war strips you down to, in the end. Not glory, not duty, just the animal wanting to keep living one more minute. The enemy fire seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere. We learned, in the brutal arithmetic of those first hours, that the Japanese defenders were not going to charge us in the open the way training films had suggested enemies might. They were going to wait in the dark, in the coral, in places we could not see, and let the island do the work of grinding us down. The officers who had promised 3 days had not accounted for an enemy that had decided not to fight a battle at all, but to make us bleed for every single yard of ground, until there was no ground left to give. The island did not need to move. It waited for us. We crawled and ran and crawled again across that beach, dragging wounded men, dragging ourselves, until we reached whatever scrap of cover existed past the sand. Eddie Walsh landed beside me at one point, breathing hard, his eyes too wide, his hand pressed against the photograph under his helmet, as if to make sure it was still there. He looked at me and tried to smile, and I tried to smile back, and neither of us managed it convincingly, and somehow that almost smile between two terrified boys is one of the clearest things I remember from that entire day. By the time the sun was fully up, I understood we were not facing soldiers in the way I had imagined soldiers. We were facing a system. Caves linked to tunnels linked to firing positions, all of it hidden inside coral ridges that absorbed our shells like a sponge absorbs water. You could fire a mortar directly into a hillside and watch the smoke clear to find the position still active, still firing, as if the mountain itself had simply shrugged off the blow. That first day, I learned the second lesson that would define everything that came after, and it had nothing to do with bullets. It had to do with water. We had been issued canteens filled before the landing, and we had been told resupply would come soon enough. Nobody told us that the coral and ash on that island held heat the way a stove holds heat long after the fire is out. The temperatures on the exposed ground would climb past anything we had trained for, that sweat would pour off us in sheets until our uniforms were soaked through and stiff with dried salt by midday. The water in our canteens, heated by the relentless sun, became something closer to hot metal than drink. Some men, fuel drums having been contaminated during transport, found their water tasted of oil, and they drank it anyway, because thirst does not care about taste. It only cares about being answered. I want you to understand something about thirst that I did not understand until Peleliu. Thirst is not simply a feeling in your throat. At first, it is. At first, it's just dryness, just an itch you ignore, because there are bullets to worry about. But as the hours pass and the canteen empties, and the sun keeps hammering down without mercy, thirst stops being a sensation and becomes something else entirely. It becomes a voice. It gets into your skull and it talks to you. It tells you that nothing else matters. Not the mission, not your buddy bleeding 3 feet away, not the orders barked through cracked lips by a sergeant whose own tongue has swollen in his mouth. It tells you water, 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 until the word loses meaning the way any word does when you repeat it enough. And yet somehow it only grows louder. The thirst was not a feeling. It was a voice. I remember the second day, or maybe it was the third. Time had already begun to smear together in a way I'll explain later. Finding a dead marine slumped against a piece of broken coral, his canteen still hanging from his belt, half full, sloshing faintly when the wind moved his body. I stood over him for what felt like a long time. Nobody was watching me. I could have taken it. My own canteen was empty, my tongue thick and cracked, my vision swimming at the edges from the heat. I told myself I was checking him for ammunition, for anything useful, the way you're supposed to. I told myself a lot of things in that handful of seconds. In the end, I took half his water and left him the rest, as if that division made me a better man than I felt. I have thought about that moment more times than I can count in the 60 years since, not because I think I did something wrong exactly. The man was already gone, and water on a dead man does no good to anyone. But because of how easily I could have taken all of it, and how the only thing that stopped me wasn't morality. It was shame. I was ashamed of how badly I wanted it. I think that shame is the truest thing I can tell you about what that island did to men. It did not just threaten our bodies. It tested whether anything decent in us could survive being that thirsty, that scared, that close to death for that long. Some of it survived, some of it didn't. The crossing of the airfield is something I still see when I close my eyes on bad nights. Even now, decades later, in a house thousands of miles and a whole lifetime away from that runway. The airfield was open ground, flat and exposed, with nothing to hide behind except the bodies of men who had tried to cross it before us. The Japanese had positioned guns on the high ground at the field's edges, with clear lines of fire across the entire open expanse. And they used that advantage with patient, terrible precision. Crossing it meant running, really running, faster than I had ever run in my life, for a stretch of ground that felt endless, while rounds kicked up coral dust in lines that chased our footsteps. I remember Sergeant Collins screaming for us to spread out, to not bunch up, his voice raw and breaking, and I remember thinking with strange clarity, even as I ran, that every single step I took was a kind of gamble against odds I couldn't calculate. Some men went down beside me, not from fear, not stumbling, but hit, dropping the way a puppet drops when you cut the strings, sudden and absolute, no drama to it at all. One moment, a man was running. The next moment, he simply wasn't anymore. War does not give you the cinematic deaths you see in films. It gives you absences. 1 second someone is there, breathing, sweating, afraid like you. The next second, there is just a gap in the world where he used to be. I made it across. I don't know how, except that the men who were aiming at me happened, in that particular handful of seconds, to be aiming at someone else. That is the whole secret of survival in a place like Peleliu. It isn't skill, not really, not most of the time. It's luck, dressed up afterward in language about training and instinct, so that it doesn't feel so arbitrary, so unbearably random. McCleary made it across too, landing beside me in a shallow depression, breathing like a man who had just run from the devil himself. Which, in a sense, he had. He looked at me, and for once there was no half-smile on his face. Nothing cynical left in him in that moment. Just the raw look of a man who had been afraid down to his bones, and was still working out whether he was going to live through the next minute. "Welcome to Peleliu," he said when his breath came back, and it wasn't a joke. It was the truest thing he could have said. The fighting on the airfield bled into the fighting at the ridges, and that is where the island showed us its real face. Bloody Nose Ridge, the men started calling it, part of the larger tangle of coral hills the maps labelled Brugol. Nothing about those maps had prepared us for what the ground actually was. It was not hills the way hills exist anywhere else. It was a maze of jagged coral spires, sharp enough to tear through boots and skin, riddled with caves and crevices that the Japanese had spent months, maybe years, turning into a fortress no map could fully capture, because so much of it existed underground, hidden, patient. The heat in those ridges was different from the heat on the beach. It radiated up from the white coral rock, baking us from below as the sun baked us from above, until the air itself seemed to shimmer with malice. We climbed and crawled over rock that cut our hands and knees raw, carrying weapons and ammunition, and the slowly dawning understanding that no amount of firepower we threw at those ridges was going to make the enemy simply disappear. Every cave we cleared seemed to reveal another cave behind it, connected by tunnels we couldn't see, so that a position we believed destroyed in the morning might open fire on us again by afternoon, as if the mountain itself was healing its wounds faster than we could inflict them. I want to tell you about the caves, because that is the part of Peleliu I have spent the most years trying not to think about, and failing. Clearing a cave meant approaching an opening in the rock that could contain anything, nothing at all, or a machine gun crew waiting in the dark with a clear shot at whoever appeared in the light. It meant throwing grenades into blackness and listening to the explosion swallowed by stone, then waiting, breath held, to see if anything moved. It meant, when grenades weren't enough, calling forward men with flamethrowers, watching streams of fire pour into the dark mouths of the earth, hearing sounds come out of those caves afterward that I will not describe to you. Sounds that told you, whether you wanted to know it or not, that human beings had been on the other side of that fire. I did not enjoy any of it. I want to be honest about that, because I think too many stories about war pretend that soldiers feel something like satisfaction in moments like that, some grim righteous justice. I did not feel righteous. I felt sick. I felt necessary, which is a different thing entirely. The cold, hollow feeling of doing something terrible, because the alternative was someone you loved dying instead. I have never been able to fully separate in my own mind the soldier in those caves from myself. He was trying to survive the same impossible island I was. He had probably been told the same kinds of lies about glory and duty that I had been told. He was probably just as thirsty as I was, just as far from home, just as afraid of never seeing it again. I did not know his name and never would, but I have thought of him more often over the years than I would have expected. This stranger I never saw, whose final moments I was responsible for, on an island that asked both of us to become something neither of us had agreed to become. That is the part of war nobody warns you about beforehand, not the fear of dying, the fear of becoming a man capable of doing what the dying required. I lost Eddie Walsh near the third ridge, on a day so hot the air seemed to bend and waver like something liquid. We had been pinned down for what felt like hours by fire from a position none of us could locate. And Eddie, who had grown steadier over the days in a way that quietly broke my heart, because it meant he was no longer a boy, moved forward to get a better angle on the source of the fire. I saw him go. I called for him to wait. He didn't hear me, or didn't listen, or maybe he understood something I didn't, that someone had to move, and he had decided it would be him. The shot that took him was so fast, I almost convinced myself, in the disordered chaos of memory, that it hadn't happened at all, that surely he would stand back up in a moment, brush the dust off, make some joke about his sister teaching herself to drive after all. He did not stand up. Ramirez reached him before I did, already murmuring something low and Latin under his breath, his fingers moving over those worn rosary beads, even as his other hand pressed uselessly against a wound that didn't need pressing anymore. I remember kneeling there, in coral dust turning dark and wet, and reaching for the photograph that had slipped from under Eddie's helmet. I don't know why I did it. I think some part of me could not stand the idea of his sister's face lying face up in the dirt of an island she would never know existed. I put the photograph in my own pocket. I carried it for the rest of the campaign, and I carried it home. And eventually I mailed it back to a family in Ohio, with a letter I rewrote 11 times because I could not find words that didn't feel like a betrayal of how senseless it had all been. I did not cry that day. There wasn't time, and there wasn't room, not with fire still coming and the rest of us still needing to move. I cried later, much later, years later, alone in a kitchen on an ordinary Tuesday, for reasons my wife couldn't understand, and that I couldn't explain to her either, because how do you explain that an entire decade can collapse into a single moment of grief you never let yourself feel when it was actually happening? There is a particular memory I have avoided telling for 60 years, and I think if I don't tell it now, I never will, and it deserves to be told, even though it does not make me look like the hero in any of the stories people wanted from men like me when we came home. It was somewhere in the ridges, in the long stretch of days that had begun to lose their edges entirely, when a man from another platoon, I never even learned his name, and that absence has haunted me almost as much as the moment itself, went down hard from shrapnel, his leg torn open, pinned in a stretch of exposed ground under fire that made movement toward him a genuine gamble with your own life. He was conscious. He was calling out, not loudly, because he didn't have the strength for loud, just a thin, desperate repetition of one word. Water! Water! Please, water! I had perhaps a quarter canteen left, and I knew, the way you know things in your body before your mind admits them, that resupply was uncertain, that the ridges ahead promised more of the same heat and the same thirst, that I might need every drop of what I carried just to keep myself functioning enough to keep fighting, keep moving, keep alive. I did not go to him. I want to write that sentence again, because it deserves to stand alone, without softening, without the kind of context that lets old men forgive themselves too easily. I did not go to him. Another man eventually did. I saw it happen from where I lay, saw someone crawl those exposed yards and pour water between cracked lips while bullets chewed up the dirt nearby. And that man's courage in that moment has stayed with me as a kind of mirror I have never enjoyed looking into, because it shows me clearly what I chose not to do. I have turned that decision over more times than I can count. I have built arguments for myself across the decades, that moving toward him might have gotten us both killed, that my water might have made no real difference to a wound that's severe, that the calculus of survival on that island sometimes required a colder kind of math than I wanted to admit existed. Some of those arguments are even true. None of them have ever made the memory weigh less. What I learned that day, more than any other day on that island, is that survival sometimes asks you to become a person you don't recognize, and that the worst part of war isn't dying. The worst part is living long enough to remember, in precise and unforgiving detail, exactly who you were willing to become in order to keep living. I went there believing courage meant moving forward. I came home knowing sometimes courage was only continuing to breathe. By that point, the 3 days the officers had promised us had become something closer to a month. Though I want to be honest and tell you that by the second week, I could no longer have told you with any confidence what day it was. Time on Peleliu did not move the way time moves anywhere else. There was no morning and afternoon and evening in any meaningful sense. Only heat that varied slightly in degree. Only stretches of fighting and stretches of waiting that bled into each other without seams. I would close my eyes for what felt like a few minutes and open them to find the light entirely changed. With no memory of where the hours in between had gone, my body began failing in small, accumulating ways. Boils from the heat and filth, dysentery that some men suffered through in silence rather than leave their positions. A haze behind the eyes that I now understand was something close to a slow unraveling of the mind, under conditions no mind is built to endure for that long. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that is not about sleep. I had certainly lost enormous amounts of sleep, snatched in fragments between watches, between barrages, between the small private terrors that kept a man's eyes open even when his body begged for rest. But the exhaustion I am talking about is deeper than that. It is the exhaustion of a mind that has spent so many days bracing for sudden death that it forgets how to do anything else. Somewhere in those weeks, I stopped flinching at explosions nearby. Not because I had become brave, because something in me had simply run out of the capacity to flinch, the way a muscle gives out after being worked too long past its limits. When the island was finally, officially declared secure, I expected to feel something like triumph. I had imagined, in whatever part of my mind still imagined anything beyond the next 5 minutes, that there would be a moment of release, of relief, maybe even of pride. There was none of that. What I remember instead is silence, a strange, hollow silence after weeks of constant noise, broken only by the low sounds of men too tired to speak, sitting or lying wherever they happened to be when the fighting finally ground down to nothing. Nobody cheered. I did not see a single man smile in genuine celebration. We looked, I think, less like victors and more like survivors of a shipwreck, blinking at a shore we had not really believed we would reach. The cost of that island sat in numbers that would only fully register for me years later. When histories were written and figures were printed in books, I could barely bring myself to read. Entire units had been gutted. Friends I had known for months were simply gone, their names becoming entries on lists instead of voices I would hear again. The operation that had been promised as a quick 3-day affair had stretched into more than 2 months of fighting in some of the worst conditions any of us had encountered. For an island whose strategic value would be debated by historians for decades afterward, long after the debate meant anything to the men who had paid for every yard of it. I did not leave Peleliu when the battle ended. Part of me stayed there, under the coral, with the men who never got old. The trip home felt unreal in a way I have never fully been able to describe. I remember standing on American soil again, in a uniform that no longer fit the man inside it, surrounded by people going about ordinary lives, buying groceries, complaining about small inconveniences, laughing at jokes that seemed impossibly light to me, as though laughter itself had become a language I had partially forgotten how to speak. People asked me, with kind faces and good intentions, whether I was happy to be home, whether I was relieved it was over, whether I felt proud of what I had done for my country. I learned quickly to give them the answer they wanted, because the true answer was too complicated, too dark, too unwilling to fit into the shape of a polite conversation at a family dinner table. Yes, I would say, glad to be home, and that was true in its way. But it was also true that I would lie awake long after my wife had fallen asleep beside me, staring at a dark ceiling, waiting for my heart to slow down from a panic I couldn't name, brought on by nothing more than the ordinary sound of a pot lid clattering in the kitchen below, a sound that some buried part of my brain insisted, for one terrifying half-second, was a grenade. Summers were difficult for years. A particularly hot, dry August afternoon could undo me in ways I never anticipated, the heat pressing down with a familiarity that had nothing to do with comfort. I would find myself reaching for water more often than I needed it, drinking it not because I was thirsty, but because some deep animal part of me needed the reassurance that it was there, that it was cold, that nobody was going to take it from me, or make me choose between keeping it and helping someone who needed it more. I did not talk about Peleliu for a very long time. Not to my wife, not to my children, not to the men I occasionally ran into at reunions who had been there with me and who, I suspect, were carrying the same silence I was, each of us assuming the others didn't want to revisit it, none of us realizing we might have helped each other simply by admitting how much of it we still carried. McCleary, I learned years later, struggled badly with drink, and I have always wondered whether that half-smile of his, the one I saw crack just once on that airfield, ever fully returned, or whether he spent the rest of his life performing it for people who needed to believe he had come through the war unscathed. Ramirez, as far as I know, became a quiet, devout man for the rest of his days. And I sometimes think that whatever he prayed for in those caves and ridges, he never fully stopped praying for it, even decades later, in the safety of an ordinary life that the war had taught him never to fully trust. Sergeant Collins, the man who counted us like something precious slipping through his fingers, did not survive the war himself. He fell in a later campaign, and I learned of it through a brief, formal letter that told me almost nothing about how he died, and everything about how thoroughly the war continued collecting its debts long after Peleliu's particular chapter had closed. I think about all of them more now, in my old age, than I did in the busy decades of work and family that filled the years in between. Strange how that happens. The mind seems to wait until it finally has the room to grieve properly, and grants you that room only once most of the rest of your life has been lived. People have often asked me, in the rare moments I have agreed to speak about it, what Peleliu taught me. I never have a clean answer, because the truth resists clean answers. I learned that courage is rarely the thing the movies show you. It is not a chest puffed out, a flag raised triumphantly against the sky. More often, courage is a man crawling across open, fire-swept ground to give water to a stranger he will likely never see again. Courage is also, I have come to believe, simply continuing to breathe through days that offer you every reason to break, and somehow not breaking, not entirely, even when parts of you are permanently altered by what you have witnessed. I learned that the enemy is not always a man with a rifle pointed at you. Sometimes the enemy is heat that will not relent. Sometimes it is thirst that turns into a voice inside your skull. Sometimes the enemy is the silence that follows you home, the nights that never quite settle, the guilt that arrives decades late and sits down at your table as though it has always belonged there. I learned that most of what gets called history in textbooks is actually thousands of private griefs, compressed and smoothed over until they read like simple facts. Names of operations, dates, casualty figures listed in neat columns that cannot begin to contain what those numbers actually cost the men who became them. Many people have forgotten Peleliu, or perhaps it would be more honest to say that many people chose to forget it, because it did not fit comfortably into the narratives that wars are usually given afterward. It was not a battle with a tidy strategic justification that history could easily celebrate. It was costly beyond what its outcome seemed to warrant, brutal in ways that resisted being turned into the kind of stirring story that gets told at parades. I understand, in a distant intellectual way, why it slipped out of the public memory the way it did. But I was there. I cannot forget it, no matter how much, in certain weak and tired moments over the years, I have wished I could. I am writing this, or speaking it, or however these words eventually reach you, because I am an old man now, and the number of us who remember that island firsthand grows smaller every year, and soon there will be none of us left to say what it actually felt like. The heat in the helmet, the coral cutting into skin, the metallic taste of a mouth gone dry past the point of comfort and into something closer to suffering. The sound of machine guns coming from places you could never quite locate. The weight of carrying a friend's photograph home in your pocket because he could not carry it himself anymore. If there is a single thing I want you to take from everything I have told you, it is this. War is not the adventure it is so often made to look like. Not in the retelling, not in the films, not in the speeches given by people who never had to choose between their own thirst and a dying stranger's. War is a debt that gets collected slowly, over an entire lifetime, paid in sleepless nights and unexplained tears, and an unbridgeable distance from people who love you, and cannot understand why a slammed door or a hot afternoon can undo, even briefly, a man who otherwise seems perfectly fine. I am not asking you to glorify what happened on that island, and I am certainly not asking you to glorify what I did or failed to do there. I am only asking you to remember that it happened, that real men, young, frightened, far from home, lived through it, and that some of them never fully came back, even the ones whose bodies made it onto the ship's home. The island is still out there, somewhere in the Pacific, quiet now, reclaimed slowly by the green it lost during those terrible weeks. I have never gone back, and I don't think I ever will. I don't need to see it again to know exactly what it looks like. I have seen it every night for 60 years. In dreams, I have stopped trying to escape, because I have come, finally, in this last stretch of my life, to understand that those dreams are not punishment. They are memory. They are the only way that men like Eddie Walsh, and the sergeant who never came home from a later war, and the nameless soldier behind that cave wall, and the dying stranger who called for water that I did not bring him, get to go on existing at all. So I remember, even now, especially now, I remember. Because someone has to.